Hey guys, welcome back. So I've already recorded this video, well most of it a couple times. It just took too long, I kept getting interrupted. Hopefully this one works out, but if it seems like I'm going really quickly and I already know what I'm going to say, it's because I do. So let's just get started. Today's video is going to be about basically choosing new gear to supplement an existing setup. So rather than the previous video I made on this topic, which will be up there, or maybe there, I don't know, up somewhere in one of these corners. In that one it was more about choosing like a first or second piece of gear, or like two things that will go together. This one is more about once you've got an existing setup, you've been saving for a while, what are you going to get next that will complement everything else in the way you want it to. So basically there are two topics to talk about today. One, just a few things to consider in terms of routing and availability of, you know, MIDI and audio routing and how you can combine different signals, etc. And the other one is about how to actually go about choosing a new device that will be the kind of thing you're looking for. Let's just start with the first topic, routing, and just an option to consider. So my current setup, Circuit Tracks, NTS1, that's it. This has two synth voices, two MIDI tracks which can control external devices, and then bring that audio from the external synth back into here to mix it and apply effects, basically making this sort of part of it. And then there's just a 4-track drum machine in here. In order to connect these, you'd think you'd need to take up one of the MIDI tracks, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong. There's a MIDI input here, and there are of course MIDI outputs here. However, there's another option. There's also a sync port here. This one has in and out, but specifically the in one, because there's a sync output on this device, you can sync them together using analog sync and still have two MIDI outputs, or two MIDI. The outputs aren't so much the problem because you can split them and have the channels do that for you. The issue is the amount of actual sequencing tracks, and there's only two, so now you have three possible sequences, but this doesn't have a built-in sequencer, so you've got it all synced up. But what can you do with that? Well, two things. One, the arpeggiator will now be synchronized with the Circuit Tracks, so if you just want to have an arp going on here throughout your song, you can do that. The other option is some user-created oscillators, which is one of the big things about this device. Users can create their own oscillators or effects, so that you can combine them with the factory stuff and create new interesting sounds. Some user oscillators include a built-in sequencer, which could be interesting. So you could use that via the sync, have it sequence itself, and it will be synchronized, and it will just be able to play itself basically. So we got MIDI sorted out. You can sequence three external devices. What about the audio though? Because if it's designed to bring two instruments' audios back in, there's only two audio inputs, right? Correct. Now there are two things to consider here. One, get a mixer. Now there is one big reason why this may be beneficial. This is in stereo. The inputs into the Circuit Tracks are only in mono, so any stereo width provided by these effects here, or even by the oscillators possibly, is just going to be lost. So using a mixer will firstly allow you to very easily manage the three audio sources plus the Circuit Tracks separately, 4 different channels. Everything's in stereo, everything works exactly how you want it to. However, that means you have to buy a mixer, which might not be the best value for money when there is another option. If being in mono isn't a big deal for you, because the Circuit Tracks will collapse this down to a mono signal, but then you can put the effects on it and it will go back to stereo, just not in the same way. If it's not a problem having things in mono, you could run one external source straight back into the Circuit Tracks and have the other one go through this audio input and then be combined with the NTS1 signal as well, and then you'll have the three signals. So you have one synth being sequenced by this and going straight back into here, one synth being sequenced by this and going into here through this, and the third one, which being this, will be synced to this, sequenced by itself, and sent back into this, which will then, that signal will include one of the synths as well. So you could have three synths accounted for in terms of sequencing and audio, however everything would be in mono in that case. One alternative, which may be a little more limiting, but it will allow you to at least keep the NTS1's internal synth in stereo, because the stereo capabilities on this are quite good. If your other two synths are in mono, you could run those two into the circuit tracks, just like you normally would, and then run that master output, including its own stereo effects, into here. But the issue is, let's say you design a sound on here that includes the effects, and then you run this master audio into here. Now this audio, which is already perfectly mixed how you want it, has its own effects in it, is now getting affected again by this series of effects which aren't designed for it. Well, that doesn't have to happen, because although this can be an effects processor and take audio in and apply effects to them, it doesn't have to be. There is a setting in here where basically the external audio comes in and gets mixed in after the effects. So you can have it either be before the master, which means this volume dial will still affect it, or I think the more sensible option would be to have it after the master, so that this volume dial is only for the NTS1 voice itself, and then you can just use the normal mixer page here to control this. You could still take advantage of this capability on a sequencer. For example, say you have a key step that has, you could basically control three-ish or three or more instruments with it. So you could have one being sequenced by the keyboard. Let's say, for example, you put a bass line in the sequencer. And then one interesting feature of the key step, I don't have a key step, by the way, I just know this because I've done a lot of research about it, because I think it is the MIDI keyboard I'm going to get once I decide to get one. But one feature of it is that you can set a sequence up and then switch to a different channel. So you can put a sequence for the bass on channel 1 and then play live over the top on channel 3 to control a different instrument. And then it also has a sync port, so you could synchronize a NTS1 or some pocket operators, possibly multiple different instruments, and have all of them running together synchronized in that way. Now, the big thing is, depending on what synths you have, you may also be able to daisy chain the audio so that you don't even have to worry about that either. So, just some considerations that a lot of things you might actually be able to play with the routing and use things in different ways. Okay, on to the next section, actually choosing the devices. So once you've figured out how many you can fit in your system, and keep in mind, as you look at devices, you want to keep looking at the sync, MIDI, audio in and out options they all have, because a lot of devices will have audio ins that aren't affected by any effects or anything, they're just a pass through, but so that you can have mixing happening in every stage, so that you don't actually have to have a mixer. So keep an eye out for that while you're searching for devices. But in terms of actual sound design functionalities, what you want to look for are primarily, there's two things you want to avoid. One, obviously avoid things that you're not interested in. Don't get an FM synth if you don't want, like if FM sounds you don't really care for them, and you don't care for learning how to design FM sounds, why would you get an FM synth? That one should be obvious. But the other one, try to avoid getting things you already have. So for example, these two are both very capable at subtractive synthesis, and they both can do wavetable synthesis to a certain degree. So getting a subtractive synth would probably not be the most useful idea. It would be fairly redundant in terms of having new sounds. But there are certainly other reasons you might. For example, maybe it has a really good workflow. Maybe it has other features such as really good effects. Maybe maybe it just has a particular filter, a particular oscillator, a particular workflow that is really beneficial. And of course, in this case, because these are both digital, analog might be another thing to consider if that's something you care about. Or the fact that because of the way these work, they're fairly limited in terms of you don't have access to all the parameters. That's not really a big issue for me, but it might be for you. So you might like to get an analog synth with control over every parameter that you can really dial in the sounds you want. But some other whole new types of synthesis, so obviously wavetables, fairly similar to, other than the actual oscillator itself, most wavetable synths have the same filter, VCA, envelopes, and LFOs going on after the oscillator. It's just the actual oscillator is constructed in a different way. It scans through different waves. So these don't do wavetables perfectly. You know, you can't upload custom wavetables to either, but I'm not really missing that feature, so I'm probably not going to get a wavetable synth. So some interesting other ideas that I could explore are the three that I'm most interested in. FM synthesis, so that could come in the form of a Volca FM, a Electron Model Cycles, possibly the Reface DX. Another sort of type of synthesis is granular synthesis. There are only two really granular oriented synths I'm aware of, so those are the GR1 by Tasty Chips, I think that's what it's called, and the Lemon Drop. Yeah, the Lemon Drop by 1010 Audio, I believe. So those two could be, probably I would go for the Lemon Drop because I'm not too invested in granular synthesis. It just seems like it could be interesting for adding more unique ambience to the background of songs, and also, like, you know, I can use it for more mainstream sound design, but that will take some learning and experimentation. But then the third category that I really want to get a hardware device for is like Buchla style West, I believe it's West Coast synthesis. So, for example, the West Pest by Create Audio is a big option for this. And there are countless, you know, actual Buchla inspired devices. That is pretty much it. That's all I've got to cover for this video. But basically, just two things to consider. Think about your options for routing things. You may be able to fit more into your setup than you initially thought. And think about getting new types of sounds into your setup. You know, do some research on different types of synthesis that are out there that you could consider, and see what you can find. Of course, budget is a big issue for a lot of people, but there are budget options in pretty much every category. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed and found it useful. If you did, make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing to my channel. If you have any comments, feedback or suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comment section down below. And other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.